The day the sky decided to murder the town of Endurance, the air didn't just grow cold. It turned into a razor-sharp sheet of frozen glass that literally sliced the breath right out of a man's lungs. It was a quiet, almost peaceful afternoon in the Dakota Territory, back in July of 1883, when the seeds of that survival were first planted, inside a cramped, dust-choked land office that smelled of dried ink and stale pipe tobacco. Tom Eldon stood before the heavy, oak counter, his fingers rough and heavily stained from his 8 years spent working as a surveyor for the Northern Pacific Railroad, tracing lines across maps that most men only looked at in newspaper clippings. Beside him stood his Sensley Enzo, wife, Clara, her eyes quiet but incredibly steady as she watched Mayor Arthur Gable adjust his spectacles and peer down at the plat map laid out between them. The map was a patchwork of green and yellow squares, representing the fertile flatlands and rolling plains that the Homestead Act promised to any man willing to stake his life on a plow and a team of oxen. But Tom's finger was not resting on the dark, rich soil of the valley. Instead, his calloused hand was placed firmly on a jagged, cross-hatched section of the map that represented a rocky, scrub-covered limestone bluff located roughly 3 miles north of the town limits. Mayor Gable let out a slow, heavy sigh that rattled the papers on his desk, looking at Tom with a mixture of confusion and frustration. He pointed out that the land was entirely worthless, noting that a plow would shatter against the hidden limestone ledges before a man could even turn a single furrow of soil. He added that the grass was too sparse to graze more than a handful of sheep, and that the only notable feature on the entire 65 hectares was a massive, dark cavern that carved deep into the southern face of the bluff. Tom did not move his hand, his voice remaining quiet and measured as he told the mayor that the hole on the side of the bluff was precisely the reason he had chosen that specific parcel of land. The mayor leaned back in his swivel chair, which groaned loudly in the quiet office, asking Tom if he seriously intended to live like a wild beast in a cave, when the town of Endurance was actively trying self-fake to build a civilized, modern community. He boasted of the new lumber mill, the milled pine siding being shipped in from the east, and the glass windows that would soon grace the storefronts of their growing settlement. He told Tom that civilized men built upward into the light, rather than burrowing backward into the dark earth like savages. Clara took a step closer to the counter, her expression entirely serene, and offered a quiet nod of agreement to her husband's choice, letting the mayor know that they intended to build a proper timber house with glass windows and a solid frame, but that they would be building it entirely inside the shelter of that limestone cavern. Mayor Gable shook his head slowly, a gesture of pure, unadulterated disbelief as he picked up the official registry stamp. He muttered that it was the most foolish waste of a homestead claim he had ever witnessed in his 10 years in office, but concluded that it was Tom's own land to ruin as he saw fit, bringing the heavy, metal stamp down with a thud that sounded like a final judgment on Tom's sanity. As they walked out into the bright prairie sunlight, Tom looked north toward the distant, shimmering outline of the bluff. His decision was not born of madness, but of years spent observing how the natural world actually behaved when the weather turned brutal. During his seasons blasting railroad tunnels through the Blache mountain ranges, he had spent countless hours inside the dark rock, noticing how the deep stone remained refreshingly cool during the sweltering heat of July, while holding a steady, comforting warmth when the winter winds scoured the plains outside. He had spent a long, bitter winter sheltering with a native scout, learning to read the subtle languages of the topography, noticing how the wind scoured the flat plains, stripping heat from anything standing in its path, while flowing smoothly over and around the natural contours of the hills like water moving around a river stone. Tom understood that the earth itself was a Radis, massive natural thermal battery, storing the sun's energy during the warm months and slowly releasing it when the world turned cold. No wood frame house, no matter how tightly built or heavily insulated with dry prairie sod, could ever match the absolute efficiency of the mountain's limestone core. The rock was a perfect insulator, a steady shield that remained completely indifferent to the seasonal extremes of the Dakota climate. While the flatlands would bake in the summer and freeze in the winter, the interior of the deep cave would remain at a constant, stable 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. By the time August arrived, the news of Tom's project had traveled through the Romans' town of Endurance, like dry grass catching fire. The homesteaders, busy raising their standard rectangular log cabins and sod houses on the flat valley floor, found great amusement in riding out to the northern bluff to watch the caveman at work. Tom, Clara, and their steady chestnut horse Rusty spent their days clearing centuries of loose rock and debris from the cave's wide mouth, which measured nearly 40 feet across and 25 feet high at its highest arch. The social pressure was constant and mocking. A new slang term began to circulate among the men at the local blacksmith shop and general store whenever a settler did something needlessly difficult or backwards. The neighbors would say he was pulling an Eldon. The children would run along the dirt roads making circles with their arms, chanting about the badger's burrow on the hill, laughing at the thought of a family living underground like rodents. One hot afternoon, Richard Dick Thorne, the wealthiest cattle rancher in the region, rode his prize stallion up the steep slope of the bluff. Thorne sat high in his polished leather saddle, looking down at Tom, who was using a heavy iron pry bar to move a limestone boulder. Thorne pointed out that his own newly completed timber barn had cost over $3,000, featuring pegged oak frames, double-sawn pine siding, and windbreak panels designed to withstand any gale the Cluting and prairie could throw at it. He asked Tom if he honestly believed a man could raise a family and keep his stock alive inside a dark, damp rock pile without looking like a fool to the rest of the territory. Tom wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, looking up at the wealthy rancher with an expression that showed neither anger nor embarrassment. He simply told Thorne that the winter would eventually show them which house was built to last, and went back to his pry bar. What Thorne and the place other detractors failed to see was the deliberate geometry of Tom's design. He had chosen a cave that faced directly south, ensuring that the low-angled winter sun would penetrate deep into the cavern's mouth, warming the stone interior during the coldest months, while the high, hot summer sun would pass directly over the brow of the bluff, keeping the living space in cool shadow. Tom did not plan to live in a raw, damp cave. He planned to build a timber frame cabin inside the shelter of the rock, positioned precisely 20 feet back from the deity of 20 feet back. Cavern's mouth. This 20-foot space created a natural porch and antechamber, acting as a massive buffer zone. When the high-velocity winter winds scoured the blank face of the bluff, the air currents would be deflected by the natural shape of the rock, slowing down and losing their destructive force before they could ever touch the wooden walls of the cabin itself. Clara worked alongside him, using her knowledge of woodwork to help design the frame. She pointed out that because the cave was composed of dry, ancient limestone, they could prevent any ground moisture from reaching their home by raising the cabin floor 2 feet off the rock base on solid stone piers. This gap would allow dry air to circulate beneath the floorboards, ensuring that the sills would remain dry and preserved for a century, completely protected from the damp earth that rotted the sills of standard log cabins. To make sure you don't miss how Tom and Clara completed this build, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and like this video so we can keep bringing you these forgotten survival stories every single week. As the golden heat of August gave way to the crisp, sharp mornings of September, the construction of the cave cabin began in earnest. Tom and Clara spent 2 weeks, harvesting white ponderosa pine logs from a protected copse 10 miles north, selecting trees that were remarkably straight and averaging 10 inches in diameter. Rusty worked tirelessly, hauling the heavy timbers up the steep, rocky trail to the mouth of the cave. Tom used his old railway surveying instruments to level the stone sills, ensuring that every corner of the foundation was square and true. The town's premier builder, William Bill Clanton, rode out one Sunday morning to inspect the work. Clanton was a man who took pride in his craft. Having built most of the prominent homes in Endurance using traditional balloon framing and milled pine siding, he stood inside the cave mouth, his hands tucked into his suspenders, watching Tom notch the heavy pine posts. Clanton shook his head, pointing out that wood was a living material that needed to feel the sun and the wind to stay dry. He warned Tom that by trapping a wooden house inside a dark stone vault, he was creating a damp trap that would rot the sills within 3 seasons, telling him that the moisture from their breath and cooking would condense on the cold limestone walls, dripping down onto the roof boards and turning the entire cabin into a moldering ruin. Tom listened carefully, respecting Clanton's experience but trusting his own calculations. He explained that they were raising the entire frame on 18-inch dry stack stone piers, leaving a generous air gap beneath the sills. He added that the walls of the cabin would not be single logs, but rather a double-plank system. The outer wall was composed of rough-cut pine boards, followed by a 4-inch interior cavity, and then a finished inner wall of planed tongue-and-groove planks. To solve the insulation problem without relying on the sod or sawdust that most settlers used, Tom and Clara had purchased several bags of raw, greasy sheep's wool from a local rancher who was glad to rid himself of the sweepings. They spent 3 days packing the 4-inch wall cavity with the greasy wool. The natural lanolin in the raw wool acted as a water-resistant barrier, preventing moisture from condensing within the walls, while the high density of the wool fibers provided an insulation value that would keep the interior warmth from escaping into the cooler cave air. Clanton examined a handful of the greasy wool, sniffed it, and tossed it aside with a grunt. He muttered that a house should be built of clean timber and plaster, not sheep's grease and cave dust, before turning his horse back toward the valley floor, confident that the first hard freeze would prove him right. But Clara had designed the joinery to be remarkably tight. She planed each wallboard by hand, fitting them together with a precision that left no gaps for drafts. The interior of the cabin, though compact at 20 feet wide by 30 feet deep, felt incredibly solid. It sat beneath the massive arch of the limestone ceiling like a ship sheltered in a deep harbor, completely protected from the sky above. By October, the autumn winds had begun to bite, carrying the first light dustings of dry prairie snow. While the settlers in the valley were already burning through their winter wood piles to combat the drafts in their log cabins, Tom focused his attention on the ventilation and heating of his cave home. He had purchased a small cast-iron potbelly stove for $22 from the general store, a modest unit that the owner had laughed at, claiming it was too small to heat a chicken coop, let alone a family home in winter. But Tom's chimney design was unlike anything the builders of Endurance had ever seen. Instead of building a traditional brick chimney that rose up the side of the wooden cabin, Tom utilized a natural vertical fissure in the limestone ceiling directly above the stove's position. The fissure ran 30 feet through the solid rock, emerging on the flat top of the bluff. To prevent the hot stove, smoke from escaping into the cave, or cooling too quickly against the damp stone, which would cause creosote to condense and kill the draft, Tom ran a Placenta's continuous, heavy-gauge iron pipe through the center of the fissure. He spent 4 days on top of the windy bluff, lowering the pipe sections and bolting them together. To insulate the pipe, he filled the gap between the iron sleeve The raw limestone walls of the fissure, with dry river sand and wood ash. This sand packing served a dual purpose. It kept the iron flue pipe hot, ensuring a strong, continuous upward draft for the stove, while protecting the surrounding limestone from thermal shock and fire hazards. On the top of the terria bluff, Tom capped the fissure with a beautiful dry-stack fieldstone chimney that stood 4 feet high, looking like a natural rock outcropping to anyone passing on the valley road below. To handle the ventilation and prevent the stale, humid air that Clanton had warned about, Tom utilized the natural physics of the cave itself. The heat from the cabin and the stove chimney created a natural upward draft through the limestone fissure. This created a gentle, low-pressure area within the cave, which pulled cold, dry prairie air into the 21's cave entrance at floor level. As the fresh air moved through the 20-foot antechamber, it was slowly warmed by the constant 55-degree temperature of the limestone floor before it even reached the cabin door. The stale, humid air inside the cabin was drawn up and out through the chimney, creating a passive ventilation system that exchanged the air without creating a single draft. The first test of the system came in late November, when a brief but sharp cold snap dropped the temperature to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Tom lit a small fire using only 3 split logs of seasoned ash. Within 40 minutes, the cabin interior had warmed to 65 degrees, and it held that warmth for 6 hours after the fire had burned down to coals. Olaf Henriksen, a Norwegian neighbor who had spent his winter splitting wood until his hands bled, stopped by to return a borrowed plow. He stood in the cabin doorway, his coat unbuttoned, staring at the stove in disbelief. He asked Tom how much wood he had burned to keep the room so comfortable. When Tom showed him the small bucket containing only 3 split logs, Olaf shook his head, muttering that his own cabin had consumed a full wheelbarrow of pine that morning and still felt like an icebox. The difference was the rock. The massive limestone walls of the cave had begun to absorb the ambient heat of the cabin, acting as a giant thermal battery that radiated warmth back into the room long after the stove had cooled. The change began on the morning of the 8th of February, 1884, with a silence so absolute it felt heavy. Tom stood on the southern ledge of the bluff, looking out over the vast, flat expanse of the Dakota Prairie. His surveyor's training had taught him to read the subtle indicators of the atmosphere, and what he saw filled him with a quiet, urgent concern. The birds, usually active along the brushy draws, had vanished completely. The barometer he had mounted on the cabin wall had dropped faster in 3 hours than he had ever seen during his years on the railroad. By noon, the western horizon had taken on a strange yellow-gray hue, like the color of an old bruise. The air felt thick, heavy with static, though the temperature was already dropping rapidly. Tom knew the signs. An Alberta Clipper, a massive polar storm system, was screaming down from the Canadian plains, carrying with it a mountain of moisture and Arctic air. He saddled Rusty and rode quickly into Endurance to secure his final supplies and warn his neighbors. He found Bill Clanton at the lumber yard, helping a teamster load pine sills onto a wagon. Tom pulled his horse up, telling Clanton that the barometer had bottomed out and that the sky was showing the classic signs of a classic, historic freeze. He urged Clanton to tell the townspeople to bank their sills with straw, secure their chimneys, and make sure their firewood was under cover. Before nightfall, Clanton looked up, wiping his brow, and let out a short, dismissive laugh, telling Tom that it was winter in Dakota and that the wind always blew cold, advising him not to get spooked inside his rock hole. Tom rode to the general store, repeating his warning to Dick Thorne, who was loading sacks of flour onto his sleigh. Thorne didn't even look up, muttering that his timber barn was designed to withstand a hurricane and that his cattle were safer than any man hiding in a cave. He told Tom to worry about his own badger hole and leave the ranching to men who knew how to handle the plains. Tom did not argue. He bought 2 sacks of grain, a tin of lard, and rode hard back to the rain bluff as the first cold gusts of wind began to whip the dry grass. By the time he led Rusty into the cave, the temperature had dropped from 15 degrees, 5 below zero in less than 20 minutes. The wind began to moan through the fairy-macted pine draws, a low, ominous sound that quickly rose to a high-pitched shriek as the sky ripped open, swallowing the world in a screaming vortex of white. Tom barred the heavy oak door of the cabin, feeling the absolute solidness of the structure. The limestone cave took the full impact of the wind, deflecting the front, horizontal sheets of snow away from the cabin walls. Inside, the air was warm, holding steady at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, with only a modest fire burning in the stove. The animals Rusty, the milk cow, and their 2 goats stood calmly in their cave stalls, shielded from the terrifying wind, their body heat naturally rising to warm the air within the limestone vault. The blizzard raged for 7 days and 7 nights, a relentless polar monster that showed no mercy to the settlements on the flat plains. In Endurance, the wind screamed at 80 miles per hour, creating drifts that reached the protit, second-story windows of the conventional homes. The cold was so severe, moisture from people's breath froze on the inside of their walls, creating sheets of ice that grew thicker with each passing hour. On the 3rd night of the storm, the tragic consequences of conventional pride played out on Dick Thorne's ranch. His grand $3,000 timber barn, built to showcase his wealth, rather than cooperate with the topography, acted as a massive snow fence. The prevailing northwest winds drove the snow against the barn's long northern wall, building a drift that eventually rose to a height of 20 feet, extending over the roofline. The timber trusses, designed for normal vertical loads, but not the immense weight of wet drifted snow, began to groan under the Drader pressure. At midnight, with a sound like a cannon shot, the main support beams splintered and collapsed, bringing the heavy roof down into the stalls below. 20 head of Thorne's finest breeding cattle were crushed instantly, or suffocated in the freezing ruins. Thorne and his hands, trapped inside the main house by a 12-foot drift that blocked their doors, could only listen to the sounds of their fortune being destroyed. Meanwhile, in the center of town, Bill Clanton's family faced their own crisis. The horizontal wind, driving the snow with the force of sand, had scoured the heat from the sills of his frame house. To combat the freezing cold, Clanton had run his wood stove at full blast for 48 hours. But the extreme cold outside, combined with the dampness of his outdoor woodpile, which had soaked through its canvas cover during an earlier thaw, had cooled the chimney flue too quickly. A heavy ice plug formed at the top of his chimney, killing the draft and forcing thick, acrid smoke back into the living room. Choking and blinded, Clanton was forced to douse the fire to avoid suffocation. Within 3 hours, the temperature inside his insulated frame house dropped to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The family huddled in the kitchen, under layers of quilts, their hands numb, their breath pluming in the dark as they listened to the wind, clawing at the pine siding. The contrast between the town and the cave was a matter of simple arithmetic. While the settlers burned through 50 to 70 pounds of wet, frozen wood a day just to keep their rooms above freezing, Tom's cabin used only 12 pounds of dry pine to maintain a steady, comfortable 65 degrees. The limestone walls of the cave, fully charged with heat, acted as a shield, preventing the cold from reaching the cabin sills. Tom's sand-insulated chimney flue drew perfectly, the heat from the stove keeping the flue pipe clear of ice, venting the smoke safely through the bluff's exterior cap. While the town of Endurance was slowly freezing under the weight of the storm, the Badger's burrow remained a sanctuary of warmth and life. On the evening of the fifth day, with the storm still showing no signs of letting up, Tom heard a faint, frantic scratching at the heavy oak door. He unbarred the lock and threw the door open, his lantern light cutting through the dimness of the cave antechamber. Two figures, so encrusted with ice and snow, they looked like pale ghosts, stumbled across the threshold and collapsed onto the plank floor. Keep Bill Clanton and his 16-year-old son. They had spent 6 hours tunneling through a 10-foot drift to escape their freezing house, then fought their way through the zero-visibility whiteout. Guided only by the high-visibility wire fence line Tom had strung along the trail during the summer. Clanton's face was white with frostbite, his hands so stiff he could not open his fingers. Tom and Clara carried them to the hearth, wrapping them in warm wool blankets, while Clara heated a pot of rich beef broth. Clanton held the warm mug with trembling hands, looking around the cabin in absolute silence. The room was quiet, peaceful, and held a steady warmth that felt like summer, compared to the frozen tomb of his own home. He looked at Tom, his eyes filled with tears, and admitted that he had been wrong, whispering that they would have frozen to death in another 3 hours if they hadn't found the cave. They were only the first to arrive. Over the next 36 hours, as word of lack, the cave's survival spread among those who could move. A desperate stream of survivors made their way up the bluff. Mayor Arthur Gable arrived on the Mersade afternoon of the 6th day, his hands frozen to his horse's reins, his face blackened by frostbite after his house roof collapsed under a snowdrift. He was followed by Abigail Wright, the schoolteacher, who had fought her way through the drifts with 3 of her youngest students who had been staying with her when the storm hit. They had spent 48 hours in a freezing schoolhouse before the sills began to give way under the wind load. Tom and Clara welcomed every soul that reached their door, offering warm blankets, dry clothes, and hot food. They made no complaints about the crowding, offered no words of blame, and never once mentioned the mockery of the summer months. The cabin, though compact, accommodated them all. The 20-foot antechamber between the cabin and the cave mouth became a sheltered sleeping area for the stronger men, warmed by the passive air circulation from the cabin stove. The physical design of the cave home handled the sudden crowd without difficulty. The French gravel, drained beneath the floor, easily absorbed and channeled away the moisture, generated by 27 people breathing and drying their wet clothes. The natural stack effect of the insulated chimney fissure kept the air fresh and clean, drawing the stale air out while pulling preheated, dry air in from the blank cave entrance. The animals in their stalls remained calm, their quiet presence providing additional comfort to the children who nestled against Clara's wool-insulated walls. On the 8th morning, the wind finally died, and the sun rose over a valley that had been completely transformed. Snow sculpted into monstrous shapes covered everything. The town of Endurance was gone, buried under drifts that reached the rooftops. Tom was the first one out, leading a party of strongest men down the slope to begin the search for survivors. The devastation was horrific. 12 people had frozen to death in their homes during the storm, and nearly 80% of the town's cattle had perished in the open or beneath collapsed barns. Dick Thorne had lost his entire herd of breeding stock, his grand timber barn lying in splinters under a 20-foot drift. A week later, as the town began the slow, painful process of digging out, Dick Thorne walked up the steep path to the cave bluff. The arrogant rancher was a changed man, his face gaunt, his shoulders slumped as he stood before the limestone entrance, his hat held in his hand. He looked at the solid, dry cabin inside the place rock, then at Tom, who was helping Bill Clanton repair a broken sled. Thorne looked down at his boots, his voice cracking with emotion as he told Tom that he had come to apologize for his earlier arrogance, admitting that he had called the cave a folly when it was actually the only structure in the county built with true wisdom. He thanked Tom for saving his neighbors, acknowledging that, without the shelter of the rock, 27 more families would have been buried in the snow. Bill Clanton stepped forward, pulling a small leather notebook from his pocket, and asked Tom if he could study his drawings of the sand-insulated chimney and the raised sills. He admitted that he had spent his life building houses to fight the weather, but that Tom had built one that cooperated with it, asking Tom to teach him how to design for the land. Tom smiled, placing a hand on Clanton's shoulder, and told him that the knowledge belonged to the prairie, not to him, and that they would rebuild the town, together, using the lessons the stone had taught them. Over the next 3 years, the architecture of Endurance shifted permanently. Clanton and Tom designed and built 11 new Eldon Shelters homes, banked with earth built into south-facing hillsides or protected by deep stone windbreaks. The town rebuilt, not in defiance of the prairie's moods, but in cooperation with them. James and Clara lived in their warm, dry cave home for another 30 years, raising their children in a space where winter was simply a season to be enjoyed, not feared. They were buried together on the crest of the bluff, overlooking the wide mouth of the cave that had been their sanctuary. In 1952, the State Historical Society installed a bronze plaque at the entrance of the cave, set into the dry limestone wall near the path. The plaque stands as a quiet reminder to all who pass that the most radical and lasting innovations are often those that listen to the earth rather than attempt to conquer it. The cave remains silent, holding its constant 55-degree warmth, completely indifferent to the summer heat and the winter gales that still scour the Great Dakota Plains.